Hi, Acadiana. Meteorologist Dave Baker here on a Wednesday. Today's August the 19th. Welcome to Let's Talk Tropics. Pretty quiet out there again today, but I will say after yesterday's show, looking at the GFS model and some of its run-to-run consistency, GFS seems to be picking up on maybe some more blips within the next couple of weeks. Also, I noticed that even though the Euro isn't really paying much attention to this tropical wave that's currently coming off of the African coast, that's kind of the one that the GFS has been pretty consistent with developing. But the Euro model is also suggesting maybe about a week down the road that a low will come off of the African coast, and that one might actually develop. And I will say that the GFS on some of the latest models are now starting to indicate more of a parade of storms. The good news is all of these are supposed to stay out in the Atlantic. There's a big ridge of high pressure that's going to be out there, a bit of a trough that's going to come off the East Coast, so that might funnel most of the action and keep it well offshore. So that is really the hope here as we go into the peak of the hurricane season. Check it out. Beautiful day here in South Louisiana, although yet another very hot one with temperatures pushing into the upper 90s, and those heat index values are going to climb. I would be on the lookout for a pop-up shower and thunderstorm. Now, I don't think everybody's going to be seeing rain today. It'll only be a few of you, but if any of these thunderstorms are able to break through the cap, they can get pretty powerful because there's a lot of energy in the atmosphere, a lot of that with the daytime heating later today. So if we get a sea breeze boundary, an outflow boundary to collide, and you get a thunderstorm to pop up, it can dump some serious rain and have some gusty winds in a short period of time. So just be on the lookout for that. I don't think many of us are going to see rain, but if you do, it could be a rough one. There's a look at Panama City Beach. Got a little cloud cover there here this morning and a little more sunshine as you work westward over toward Orange Beach. Looks like everything nice and smooth there. Beautiful morning across the Gulf Coast, Dauphin Island. A lot of sunshine there. Looks like our Cocodrie cam kind of went on the fritz, but I do know that there's partly cloudy skies there. And then as you work westward over toward Galveston, you got a little bit of fair weather cloudiness, but all in all, a pretty quiet day here along the Gulf Coast. And if you are going to be doing some boating, and for our friends out in the offshore waters who are working today, I don't think you're going to have any issues out there. Winds are going to be fairly light out of the south, or maybe the southwest rather, at about maybe up to 10 knots. Seas probably about a foot or so, and of course the inland lakes and waterways are going to be just fine. Organized showers and thunderstorms still rotating around a big ridge of high pressure, but that ridge is kind of pushing off toward the west, and we do have a bit of a frontal boundary that's kind of draped like this. And over the last couple of days, we've had some development of thunderstorms in these areas, and we've had a couple of outflow boundaries that have come across southeastern Louisiana that have provided some widely scattered showers and thunderstorms there for the eastern part of our state, and I think there might be a chance for that again. But the evidence is showing that we're going to see a little bit more in the way of showers and thunderstorms over southeastern Louisiana, and then a few of those could work their way across the basin. And you can see once again, we've got a decent amount of moisture here, and that's probably where our thunderstorm development is going to be. But there's a lot of energy here across southwestern Louisiana. Again, there's a cap in place. It's kind of like the lid on the pot because of that ridge of high pressure. But if it can punch through that, you can get a pretty big thunderstorm that can dump some locally heavy rain, because if it does pop up, there's not a lot of steering currents to move it along. But as far as the Gulf waters, you don't have any issues with any tropical weather. We do have a bit of a trough right here that's going to bring some showers to the west coast of the Bay of Campeche, but nothing that we're expecting to develop there. And then we've got a frontal boundary out here off the east coast of the U.S. once again, and that could occasionally produce something, but it doesn't look like anything's trying to get going. Tropical wave is continuing to move westward away from Central America. That was some action we had last week over the Atlantic. Kind of got sheared apart. No worries there. And the rest of the Caribbean is actually looking fairly clear. You see a little bit of Saharan dust that's kind of coming in there across parts of the western Atlantic, and then more what we would consider maybe kind of a frontal boundary that's in this particular area near the Bahamas. Now, farther out, There is another pretty decent tropical wave that's coming off the African coast. This is the one that the GFS model wants to try to develop, but kind of rounding a big ridge of high pressure and then kind of keeping it out over the Atlantic basin, which would be typical. And a lot of the times when we get these tropical waves rolling off the African coast, many times they do stay over the Atlantic. But at least for the National Hurricane Center, they are not expecting any new development over the next week or so, although we'll keep an eye on that wave as well, as I believe they will too. But something interesting here, the global tropics hazard outlook that was really quiet last week has now picked up a little bit of action. Again, remember I told you the GFS model that I'm going to show you is kind of showing more of a parade of storms here for the next 2 weeks. But we're taking this right up to the peak of the hurricane season, which is September the 10th. And even though we are seeing a little bit of shading there over parts of the Atlantic with maybe less than 30% on any chances for development, this is still a very boring map for late August and early September. Usually this thing would be a lot more colorful in a normal type of season, but since we're in an El Nino season, a lot of wind shear out there, so maybe we're still going to be running a little bit behind schedule when it comes to the total number of named storms. So I do want to start out with the GFS, and this is going to be the 6Z run. So this is fairly early in the day. 12Z doesn't come down until after, well, it isn't complete really until after I record this show. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that first wave that's coming off of the African coast. You can kind of see right about in here. Now, there's a little low right there. I wouldn't pay much attention to that. But as we push forward here, you see that low coming across the Atlantic. And you see here that the GFS, and I will say the GFS has been consistent model run to model run, which is something we look at first. So we do want to compare the other models, but sometimes we like to look at the same model and see if it's coming up with the same solution over and over and over again. So if you get one, let's say the 0Z shows nothing, and then the 6Z shows a major hurricane, and then the 12Z shows nothing again, that's inconsistency. We want to see kind of the same thing from model run to model run, and that's kind of what we've been seeing with the GFS here. So as we roll this into motion and we start to go into early next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, you are still seeing at least a bit of a low pressure area here that's approaching the islands. Now remember, we got this big ridge here, and you got a bit of a trough over here, so likely anything that would develop should steer off toward the north. Now, Canadian provinces, I can't say you're out of the woods, but I would say most of the East Coast, based on this particular model, pretty much looks okay. And then as we go out beyond the 10 days, one of the things I want you to notice here is, like I said, we got a bit of a parade of storms here that are coming across the Atlantic basin. And the GFS has been also a bit consistent of keeping this secondary one. And this one in particular is one we're going to kind of pay attention to as well, because it shows up on the Euro model as something relatively strong. So let's go over to the Euro. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and grab the 0Z. Well, we can just real quick go through the early part of this model here. And you can see as we go out for the next several days, remember the wave that was over the central Atlantic with the GFS? You see that the Euro really doesn't even pick up on anything. So you got some differences between the global models, but I want you to pay attention as we start to get out toward about day 7. And then I'm going to switch to the earlier model, because this is as far out as the GFS 6Z goes. And what you're seeing is you're starting to see a pretty decent tropical wave here coming off of the African coast. So now I want to just pull the older model so that we can go farther down the road, because the 6Z only goes out, I believe, to 144 hours, while the 0 and the 12Z go out considerably farther than that. I believe it is 10 days. So now we're on the 0Z, and we can just kind of continue along. Now, remember, we're kind of getting out into la-la land here. We're starting to approach day 10. Whoops, we're going to show day 10. But you can see that the Euro model has something pretty significant here going out 10 days. And again, we've got the trends on the GFS, and again, remember we're talking about the parade of storms here. So there is another low that's coming off. So there are some similarities between the GFS and the Euro, with the exception of the initial wave that's coming off the African coast right now. So perhaps in about a week, another wave could come off and we may see some development, which would support some of the info we're getting from the Global Tropics Hazard Outlook, which goes out to week 2 and week 3. So we'll just go ahead and pull this all the way to the very end of the model, which is going all the way out into the early part of September. But again, the GFS, or rather the Euro, is still calling for something pretty significant there over the central portion of the Atlantic Ocean. But as you would probably notice, there's really nothing that's coming toward the Caribbean, nor any homegrown stuff closer to the Louisiana or the Gulf Coast, which is kind of our worry as we start to get into September. Not only these long-running systems, but late September, early October, some of the development stays a little bit closer to home, and that's where we get a little bit worried. We've seen that in past hurricanes that moved across the Gulf waters. Michael is one of those. I think, was it Mitch was the one that was, I get the names confused, but it was just a few years ago, or maybe 2 years ago, we had a system that developed here, became a Category 5 real quick, and then weakened before making its way over toward the Tampa area. I want to say that one's Mitch. No, I can't remember exactly what name that was, but those are the kind of storms that we start to see a little bit later on in the hurricane season. So just for fun, let's just go ahead and grab the Canadian. We'll roll it back here, see if we got any similarities. Looks like that wave maybe that the GFS is picking up on could be moving across, and then you got that parade of storms there, kind of like what we're seeing with the GFS and somewhat with the Euro. So maybe we've got a little bit of agreement there. And we'll finish off with the icon just to look at the global models, because everything here is really beyond a week from now. So we got to really look at the long range models. But the icon doesn't go out very far. It only goes out 7 days. But kind of like what we're seeing with the GFS, or rather the Euro and the Canadian, perhaps we'll get some development there in a little over a week. So something that we'll be watching here for the next few days. Now, Saharan dust is starting to back off just a little bit, lifting a little bit farther north, but there's still plenty out there. And also kind of noticing that in the area of the path of where we get these tropical waves off the African coast, wind shear has diminished somewhat. It's still kind of strong here as you get over to the Caribbean islands, and then out here off the East Coast and over toward the Bahamas. It tends to be a little bit lower there too. So if that trend continues and we start to see the wind shear lowering, then I would start to get a little bit more worried about something actually getting going there over parts of the Atlantic Ocean. Do want to talk about the El Nino index, which has been kind of fluctuating between 2.25 and 2.3, which is on the higher end of the scale. It is not quite crossed the threshold of the number 3, which is 1982-83, but the model forecasts are still calling for an increase in those temperatures, and most of the models are pushing this up to number 1 or number 2 on the scale. So El Nino is still going to be an issue when it comes to the peak of the hurricane season. It should help us out, hopefully, with more wind shear and prevent some of these storms from developing. Obviously, if you've been following the news, you know that the Pacific has been considerably more busy, which usually does happen during El Nino seasons. A lot of that warm water that's developing off the South American coast does kind of transcend across the Pacific basin, and you get a lot more heat transfer between the ocean and the atmosphere, and that's why you get a lot more tropical weather there over the Pacific. And of course, Lala was one of those unusual ones that moved near Hawaii. So busy season over on the Pacific. On the Atlantic side, for the rest of this month, you still got a decent amount of development, but I will warn you that September is always a much busier month. As you see, you get that little curvature. So the majority of those bigger hurricanes and tropical storms that move from the middle part of the Atlantic do tend to stay away from the east coast of the U.S., and you get a little bit less in the way of development in the Caribbean and the Gulf this time of the year. And then we'll kind of focus back on the Caribbean and the Gulf as we start to move into October. And by November, we can usually breathe a sigh of relief if we haven't had any activity come through. So we're just about 3 weeks away from the peak of the hurricane season. And then as we start to get toward the end of October, most of the action drops off really, really nicely. So, but remember, it only takes one tropical storm or hurricane to really mess things up. So hopefully we're going to stay cool and dry and not worry about any of these. And if anything develops, we're really hoping that these are going to stay out in the Atlantic, and that is kind of showing up somewhat when we're talking about some of the computer models. Well, I hope you enjoy Let's Talk Tropics. If you do, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and also turn on those notifications. And don't forget, you can catch my forecast on TV again at WBRZ Channel 2. I'll be there for Tune In on Friday, which starts at 5 a.m. I'm also there over the weekend. Our weekend shows start at 9 o'clock, both Saturday and Sunday, but there are going to be some changes in the next couple of weeks. Our Saturday show is going to start at 10 because we've got SEC football starting up once again. So we like to lead into the SEC football show. So kind of a delayed show and a great sports show when SEC football gets going. Our sports team over there at WBRZ certainly is a great team, and they've got some really awesome shows when we switch over to 10 o'clock. So you might want to check that out if you're an LSU fan. Check it out. Also, my social media pages on Facebook and X. Thanks for all my subscribers, too, to Acadiana Weather Today right here on YouTube. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Have yourself a great Wednesday. I'll see you on Thursday.